To everyone else in that restaurant, I was just a girl in a black apron who refilled water glasses without being asked. I'd been watching that table for 40 minutes. The couple had arrived at 7:15. He was the kind of man who made the host nervous, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. He moved through the room like he already owned it, and in a way, I suppose he did. His name was Jonathan Reeves, though I only knew that from the reservation. Everyone in Vancouver's financial district knew what Jonathan Reeves actually was. The legitimate side was real estate development, towers going up in Yaletown, a mixed-use project on the waterfront in North Van. The other side was the reason I was there. His wife sat across from him in a green dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent in East Van. She was laughing at something her father had just said. Her father, Gordon Stafford, sat at her right. Her mother, a thin woman, with a pearl necklace and careful eyes, sat beside him. The four of them looked like a perfectly normal family dinner at a nice restaurant on a Wednesday evening in October. They were not a perfectly normal family. I had been working at Albright's for 8 months. I applied for the job because the tips were good and the kitchen staff were decent, and because I needed to get out of the apartment I'd shared with my ex for 3 years. What I didn't expect, walking into that job, was to fall into something that would change the course of my entire life. But that's not where the story starts. The story starts 6 weeks before that dinner, when I found out what Gordon Stafford had actually done to his daughter. I met her at the bar after my shift ended. She wasn't there to drink. She'd ordered a sparkling water and was turning the glass in her hands when I sat down on the stool beside her, too tired to take my apron off. She looked at me and I looked at her and she said, "You work here?" "I do," I said. "Do you know who Jonathan Reeves is?" I did. I'd served him twice before. He tipped well, said please and thank you, and had the kind of handshake I imagined that made other men feel like they'd agreed to something. "Why?" I asked. She told me her name, Lydia Reeves. She was his wife. She didn't look like a woman in distress. She looked composed, the kind of composed that costs a person a lot to maintain. She told me that her husband had been getting threats. Not the vague kind. Not the kind that businessmen sometimes got when a deal went sideways. The specific kind. The kind with dates and places, and a clear intention behind them. She told me she'd gone to her father for help. He was well connected. I already knew that. Gordon Stafford had done 25 years in commercial law and knew every mover in the city. She'd told her father that she was scared, that she believed the threats were real, that she needed someone to help her figure out who was behind them. Her father had told her not to worry. He said he'd look into it. He said to trust him. She'd felt better for about 2 weeks. Then she found the email. She hadn't been snooping. She'd borrowed her father's laptop to print a boarding pass when she was visiting her parents in West Vancouver, and his inbox was open, and the name in the subject line stopped her cold. It was the name of a man her husband had told her to stay away from. A name she'd heard spoken in a low voice in a phone call. Jonathan had taken in the garage at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night 6 months ago. She read the email. She sat in her father's study for 10 minutes and didn't move. Then she closed the laptop and came downstairs and had dinner with her parents and drove home and got into bed and stared at the ceiling until 4 in the morning. Her father had not been looking into who was threatening her husband. He had been coordinating with them. She didn't know why. She didn't know what Gordon Stafford owed these people, or what agreement he'd made, or whether money was involved, or power, or something older than both. What she knew was that her father had organized a dinner, this dinner at Albright's, on the 3rd Wednesday of October, and that her husband didn't know what it was really for. She looked at me over her sparkling water and said, "I can't tell him. If I tell him, he'll confront my father, and if he confronts my father, they'll know I know, and then..." She stopped. "I don't think I'll be safe." "Then leave," I said. "Both of you, just leave. He won't leave without a reason. He doesn't take threats seriously enough. He thinks he can handle everything." She looked down at the bar. "He's been handling things his whole life. He doesn't know when he can't." I thought about it. She was right. I'd seen it in the 2 times I'd served him. That specific kind of confidence that looks like calm, but is actually a man who has never been caught off guard in a room and doesn't believe he ever will be. "So what do you want from me?" I asked. She said, I need someone in that room who's not connected to any of this. Someone who can get close enough to warn him without anyone knowing the warning came from me. I looked at her for a long time. "I'm a waitress," I said. "I know," she said. "That's exactly why." I almost said no. I want to be honest about that. I went home that night and made tea and sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. I thought about what kind of people were involved, not the kind who accepted loose ends. I thought about the fact that I had no particular skill in this area, no training, no backup plan. I thought about my mother, who lived in Kelowna and called me every Sunday, and would be devastated to know I was even considering this. But I kept coming back to one thing. Lydia Reeves had come to a bar alone on a Tuesday night and sat down next to a stranger in an apron because she had no one else. Her husband didn't know. Her friends, she said, were mutual, all tangled up in the same world as her father. She had a therapist she trusted, but this wasn't a therapy problem. And she couldn't go to the police without evidence beyond a single email she hadn't photographed and couldn't access again. She was completely alone with the knowledge that her father had agreed to something that would end her husband's life. I thought about what it would mean to know that and do nothing. I called her the next morning and said yes. The 6 weeks between that conversation and the dinner were the longest of my life. I worked my regular shifts. I smiled and took orders and described the halibut special and recommended the Pinot Grigio from the Okanagan. I watched the front door every time it opened. I paid attention to the rhythm of the room in a way I never had before. Who the regulars were, who the staff trusted, which section had the best sightlines. Lydia and I met twice. Both times at different coffee shops, 20 minutes apart, paying cash. She was careful in a way that told me she'd thought about this a lot longer than I had. She'd looked at the reservation, her father had made it, and confirmed the date, the table number, the time. The table was in my section. I don't know whether that was luck or whether Lydia had engineered it. I never asked. She told me to keep the message simple. Don't explain. Don't name anyone. Just get him alone for 30 seconds and tell him the dinner isn't what he thinks it is. Tell him to leave. He'll understand. He's been in enough rooms to know when something isn't right. He just needs someone to say it out loud. What if he doesn't believe me? I asked. Tell him to check the coat of the man at the bar, she said. My father's associate. Left breast pocket. He always carries written instructions. Jonathan will recognize the handwriting. I didn't ask how she knew that. I decided there were some things I was better off not knowing. The night of the dinner, I got to Albright's an hour early and stood in the back near the linen shelves and talked myself into staying calm. My hands were fine. My voice, when I tested it on the hostess, was fine. I was good at being invisible in a room. That was the whole point. They arrived at 7:15, exactly as the reservation said. Jonathan Reeves came in first, a hand at the small of Lydia's back. He looked the way he always did, unhurried, attentive, like a man who has learned to notice everything without appearing to notice anything. Her father followed, holding the door for her mother, who was already smiling at the room the way people do when they've decided in advance to have a good time. I brought the menus. I introduced myself. I described the halibut. I poured the water. Everything was fine. For 20 minutes, everything was fine. The conversation at the table was light. Her parents asking about a renovation Jonathan had been planning, something about a kitchen in their place in Deep Cove. Lydia laughed in the right places. Her father told a story about a case from 30 years ago, something about a misplaced document and a very angry judge. He was good at it, at performing, at being a man who has dinner with his son-in-law and doesn't think about what comes next. I watched him from behind the service station and felt something cold settle in my chest. At 7:40, her father excused himself to take a call. He stepped toward the back hallway that led to the restrooms. As he passed the bar, he stopped for a moment and said something to the man sitting alone at the second stool. A man who had ordered a club soda and not touched it. They didn't look at each other when they spoke. That was when I knew. Not that I hadn't known before, I had. But that was when it became something I could see with my own eyes, rather than something I was taking on faith. I counted to 30. I picked up a water pitcher that didn't need to be refilled. I walked to the table. I poured for Lydia's mother first, then moved to Jonathan's right side. I leaned in slightly, the way you do when you're about to say something quietly. And I said, just to him, just barely above the noise of the room, the dinner isn't what you think it is. You should leave now. Check the coat of the man at the bar before you do, left breast pocket. I set the pitcher down and straightened up and said, loud enough for the table, can I tell you about the dessert menu this evening? Lydia's mother said she'd love to hear it. I described the creme brulee and the dark chocolate torte without looking at Jonathan Reeves. My voice was steady. I did not shake. When I finished, I walked back to the service station and didn't turn around for 2 full minutes. When I did, Jonathan Reeves had his phone in his hand under the table. He was looking at it, not the screen, holding it, very still. His expression hadn't changed. But he'd shifted forward slightly in his seat, the way a person does when they've just been plugged back into something they'd switched off. He said something to Lydia. I couldn't hear what. She put her hand over his on the table and squeezed it once. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and in that look was an entire conversation that had no words and needed none. He didn't make a scene. He was never going to make a scene. He excused himself for the restroom. On his way, he paused at the bar. I watched from across the room. He leaned past the man on the second stool. Not confrontationally, just reaching, the way you'd reach past someone for a coat hook. And when he came back upright, his hand was in his jacket pocket, and he was already walking back toward the table. He sat down. He looked at Gordon Stafford. His face was completely neutral. He said, I actually need to move our evening along. I've got an early call with the Vancouver office tomorrow. Gordon Stafford looked surprised for just a moment. It was a small surprise, quickly smoothed over. Of course, he said. We can do this again soon. Absolutely, Jonathan said. They finished their drinks. He paid the bill. He insisted, firmly, warmly, the way a man insists on something when he wants no debt on either side of the table. He helped Lydia with her coat. He shook his father-in-law's hand. I watched Gordon Stafford's face during that handshake. He was still smiling. He didn't know. The family left together through the front door. Jonathan and Lydia turned left. Her parents turned right toward the parking lot on Hornby Street. The man at the bar left a few minutes later without finishing his club soda. I finished my shift. I counted my tips. I helped reset the section and put the chairs up on the tables I wasn't responsible for because the closing staff were short that night, and it's just the kind of thing you do. I went home on the SkyTrain and stood at the doors and watched the city lights in the dark tunnel glass and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not relief, exactly. Not pride. Something quieter than both. My phone buzzed just before I got off at Commercial Drive. A message from a number I didn't recognize. Thank you. 2 words. No name. No punctuation. I deleted the message. I walked home. I made tea. I won't pretend I knew what happened next in real time. That's not how it works when you're as peripheral to something as I was. I found out in pieces slowly. The way you find out things when you've been careful about how involved you let yourself get. Jonathan Reeves didn't pursue Gordon Stafford through any channel I was aware of. What he did was quieter than that. Gordon Stafford's firm lost 3 major clients over the following 6 weeks. Large commercial accounts that had been with him for years. The kind of accounts that don't just leave. The kind that get encouraged to leave by someone with more leverage than them. Gordon Stafford didn't know how it started. Maybe he suspected. But Jonathan Reeves never confronted him, never raised his voice, never gave him anything to push back against. He simply moved the walls of Gordon Stafford's world 2 feet closer together, and then 2 feet closer again. And then he waited. I heard this from Lydia, months later, at a coffee shop in Kitsilano. She was the one who asked to meet. She looked different. Not lighter, exactly, but like someone who had been carrying a coat in the wrong season and had finally found somewhere to set it down. She told me that Jonathan now knew the whole story, that she'd told him everything, the laptop, the email, the 6 weeks of planning, the stranger in a restaurant she'd recruited, because she had no one else. She said he'd been quiet for a long time after she told him, not angry, just quiet. Then he'd said, "You should have told me." And she'd said, "I know, I thought I had to protect you." And he'd looked at her and said, "I know." That was the part that got me. Not the logistics. Not the what happened after, or the what did Gordon Stafford do, or the where are they now. The fact that two people can be trying to protect each other from opposite sides of the same secret and both be completely wrong about what the other one needs. She told me that her relationship with her father was over. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no final phone call, no scene at Christmas. He simply stopped being called. He stopped being included. The door didn't slam. It just never opened again. "Do you miss him?" I asked. She thought about it for longer than I expected. "I miss who I thought he was," she said. "But I think I've been missing that version of him for years. I just didn't want to stop looking." I've thought about that conversation a lot since. There's a version of this story where I'm a hero, where I did a brave thing, and it mattered, and everyone got what they deserved. I'm not sure that's the true version. I'm not sure the true version has a clean moral. What I know is this. I was a woman in a black apron who refilled water glasses, and for one night, that was exactly the right thing to be. I know that Lydia Reeves sat alone in a bar on a Tuesday night with no one to call, and that she reached out to a stranger because she had run out of other options. I know that some betrayals are too large to be survived by the people who committed them. Not because justice is always clean, but because trust, once it's been used as a weapon, can't be repaired. You don't forgive the knife for what it did just because it was held by someone who was supposed to protect you. Gordon Stafford had debts I don't fully understand, made choices I can't entirely explain. But what I keep coming back to, what I think his daughter keeps coming back to, is that whatever he owed, whatever he was afraid of, whatever pressure had been brought to bear on him over however many years, he had made a calculation. He had weighed his daughter's life on one side of the scale, and then he'd had dinner with her. That's the part that doesn't go away. Not the plan, not the money, not the men in expensive coats. The fact that he sat across from her and talked about a kitchen renovation in Deep Cove and told a story about a judge from 30 years ago and laughed at the right times. He was good at it. The worst part is that I believed it too, for about 20 minutes. That's how good he was. I still work at Albright's. I'm saving up to go back to school. Environmental planning. Which is a very practical thing to study if you want to spend a lot of time on waiting lists, but I've wanted it for years, and I'm done waiting. My section is near the window now. Better tips, better sightlines, and on clear nights you can see the mountains going dark across the inlet. Jonathan and Lydia Reeves haven't been back. I don't expect them to. Some rooms are better left unreturned to. But sometimes, when it's a slow Wednesday, and the room has that specific kind of quiet that happens around 8 o'clock, when the first rush is over, and the late tables are still in the middle of their main courses. Sometimes I think about the way she squeezed his hand. Just once. Just that single moment across a table in a restaurant on a Wednesday night in October. And I think that's what I was really there for. Not to save anyone, they would have figured something out eventually. People like Jonathan Reeves don't stay in rooms that are closing in on them. But maybe I made it so they didn't have to figure it out alone. Maybe I made it so they got to leave together, through the front door, under the lights on West Georgia Street, without looking back. The world kept going. The city kept being the city, restless and wet and lit up and beautiful, in the specific way that Vancouver is always beautiful, which is like something that doesn't entirely believe in itself but can't stop trying. I clocked out. I took the SkyTrain home, and the room filled up again, like rooms always do, with people who had no idea what had just happened in it.